Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was on a damp April evening, as a light drizzle traced pale lines upon the sitting-room windows of 221B Baker Street, that I found myself once more turning over the pages of my notes, the countless strange adventures I had shared with Mr. Sherlock Holmes. But the case that has lingered in my thoughts above all others, that defied not only logic but the very laws of presence and perception, was one I had long delayed putting to paper. It was, in every sense, a puzzle without precedent, a puppet show with no audience. Holmes was sprawled upon the settee, his lank form draped across the cushions like a marionette with its strings cut. A faint tendril of blue smoke curled upward from his pipe, and his eyes, half-lidded in reflection, darted from the ceiling to the fire and back again. "Curious," he murmured, without preamble. I glanced up from my journal. "What is?" "A puppet show," said he, "with no audience." I paused, frowning. "I beg your pardon?" He sat up abruptly and gestured toward the table. There lay a single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper, an invitation, though not the kind one might expect. Holmes handed it to me. "To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, you are cordially invited to attend the final performance of Le Théâtre des Silhouettes, taking place at the Pavilion Theatre, Whitechapel. Midnight, April 12th. One night only. No guests, no applause, no audience. There was no signature, only the embossed silhouette of a harlequin mask stamped in red wax." I furrowed my brow. Some absurd jest? A prank, perhaps? Holmes did not smile. "It arrived by hand. No postmark. Delivered while you were out acquiring those tragically undersweetened biscuits you insist upon." He rose, pacing slowly. I had thought at first it was theatrical nonsense, a promotional stunt. But then came Lestrade. As if summoned by name, the familiar creak of boots echoed in the stairwell. A firm knock struck the door. "Come in," Holmes called. Inspector Lestrade entered, his face pale, lips drawn tight beneath his mustache. "Holmes," he began without greeting, "we've a situation, and I fear it's the sort of nonsense you'll love." Holmes motioned him to sit. "You'll find I'm in exactly the right mood for nonsense. Do continue." Lestrade drew a folded note from his pocket and passed it to Holmes. "Found this on the body." Holmes unfolded the note and raised an eyebrow. It was identical to the one we had received. The harlequin seal gleamed ominously beneath the flickering lamp. I stiffened. A body? Good heavens, where? The Pavilion Theatre. Whitechapel, just past midnight. Someone called it in. Said a door had been left open, the theatre in disarray. We arrived to find a scene more befitting a penny dreadful than the London stage. Holmes' voice was suddenly sharp. "Describe it." Lestrade cleared his throat. The theatre's main curtain was drawn. On stage, an elaborate puppet theatre, an entire miniature set with velvet curtains, tiny footlights, and a dozen hand-carved puppets, all of them frozen mid-performance. No stagehands, no audience, no one in the wings. "And the victim?" Holmes asked. "That's the strange part. A man, alone in the front row, no ticket in hand, well-dressed, upper class by the look of him. Dead. No wounds. No sign of violence. Seated as though he had simply fallen asleep." "Was he identified?" I asked. "Name of Mr. Ernest Bellamy. Retired publisher. Widower. Lived alone. No known vices, enemies, or debts. But that's not the worst of it." Lestrade leaned forward. "The theatre has been closed for 2 months. Condemned, in fact. No staff, no performances scheduled, no one admits to sending invitations, yet somehow everything was staged, the lighting, the sound, even a live violinist behind the curtain. And when we pulled it back, nothing. No one there, just the violin, still trembling on its string." Holmes was motionless. He took a long breath. An impossibility wrapped in orchestration. Lestrade grimaced. We've locked it down, but the brass want it swept quietly. No need for panic, they said. You'll look into it? Holmes rose, his eyes glittering. Watson, coat and gloves. We have a midnight rendezvous with shadows and string. As we descended Baker Street, the drizzle became a curtain of cold mist. The lamps flickered like fading memories, and Holmes, as ever, strode ahead, already deep in thought. I could not have known then that this case, more than any other, would bring us to the edge of illusion, through the veil of performance, and into the hidden machinery of murder. For what sort of criminal stages a performance for no one? And what sort of message is left when the show ends with death? Chapter 2. The curtain rises again. It was nearly 1:30 in the morning by the time Holmes and I stepped from our cab into the glistening puddles of Whitechapel. The fog hung low and heavy, smothering the gas lamps so their glow resembled distant candlelight behind stained glass. The Pavilion Theatre loomed before us, a crumbling silhouette of former grandeur, draped in ivy and regret. 2 constables flanked the wrought-iron gates, their figures stiff with unease. They gave a nod as Lestrade emerged from within, beckoning us without words. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and the bitter scent of rotting velvet. Dust coiled in the beams of our lanterns like smoke in a bottle, and the grand entrance hall, once a place of laughter and libations, now echoed only the creak of our boots. The building's been condemned for months, Lestrade muttered as we stepped over a torn rug and into the main theatre hall. No staff, no schedule, and no electricity, and yet... He gestured forward. The sight before us was nothing short of surreal. The house seats, faded and sagging, faced a grand stage still dressed for a performance. A full-sized marionette theatre stood at its center, ornate, lacquered, and intricately painted in gold and crimson. Velvet curtains, only slightly moth-eaten, were pulled back to reveal a frozen tableau of puppets. A tin soldier, a maiden, a jester, and a man with a crown stood mid-scene, held aloft by thin cords that vanished into the dark rafters. The dead man, Mr. Ernest Bellamy, remained in his seat, upright, as if waiting for the next act. Holmes stepped forward silently, studying the man's still form. Bellamy's eyes were closed, lips parted slightly, hands folded neatly in his lap. Not a drop of blood, not a sign of struggle. A medical man was here earlier, Lestrade said. Cause of death unknown. No trauma, no signs of poison on the skin. Heart appeared sound. He simply expired. Holmes knelt beside the corpse and examined the man's overcoat, checking the pockets and cuffs with delicate fingers. "Smell, Watson," he said, offering me the lapel. I leaned in. Old cologne. Bergamot, I'd say. And something faintly metallic. "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "You see the slight blistering on the right index finger? Faint but present, as though he touched something heated." "Poison, perhaps," I offered. "Absorbed through the skin?" "Too tidy," Holmes said flatly. "No sweat, no distress. The muscles are relaxed. Death was immediate, or nearly so." He stood and turned his attention to the puppet stage. With great care, he ascended the stairs and stepped lightly behind the miniature theatre. I followed, though warily, as the wood groaned beneath us. Behind the stage was a tangle of wires, rods, and pulleys. No operators, no footprints in the thick dust that lined the floor, save for our own and a few faint scuff marks near the left curtain. Holmes examined them with interest. No signs of prolonged activity. Whoever staged this was either extremely careful or barely present. He turned his gaze upward, eyes scanning the rafters. "Watson, your field glasses, if you please." I handed them over, and Holmes focused on the shadowed upper gantry. There's a narrow perch above the curtain rail, just wide enough for a single figure. I glanced up, shivering. Surely no one could move freely up there in the dark. Holmes only smiled faintly. You underestimate theatre folk. The right man could hang in silence for hours, waiting. We returned to the corpse. Holmes crouched again and examined the floor beneath Bellamy's seat. After a moment, he produced a small object, a crumpled scrap of parchment. Unfolding it, he studied the ink-streaked writing with a narrowed eye. The show must go on, even when no eyes remained to see it. Watson shivered. Some kind of theatrical philosophy. Holmes said nothing. He slipped the note into his coat. Lestrade was growing impatient. Well, Holmes, you've seen the scene. What do you make of it? Holmes straightened slowly. I make of it a carefully crafted illusion. A performance not meant to be seen, yet executed with all the precision of a royal debut. Which begs the question, who performs without an audience? A madman, I offered. Holmes didn't answer. His eyes drifted toward the box seats above, where shadows clung like cobwebs. Lestrade, has anyone spoken to Bellamy's associates? Family? Friends? No immediate family. One niece in Surrey. A few old colleagues. Nothing of note so far. I've sent men to question them. And the violin? Holmes asked. Lestrade gestured to a small side table near the wings. A beautifully varnished instrument lay there, a single hair still dangling from the bow. No fingerprints, no rosin dust. It was played, that much is clear. But by whom? No one saw a soul. Holmes nodded. You'll keep the theatre sealed? Of course. Good. Then I shall return tomorrow with fresh eyes and perhaps a longer thread. Lestrade gave a resigned nod, pocketing his notebook. You've your work cut out for you, Holmes. This one's a ghost story if I ever saw one. Holmes turned to the stage once more. Ghosts are merely secrets in disguise, Inspector, and every stage, however empty, conceals a trap-door. We stepped back into the cold night. The fog had thickened, and our cab ride home passed in silence. Holmes sat with his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. Bellamy, he murmured at last. A man of letters, a solitary life. No reason to die, and yet he attends a theatre long abandoned, receives a personal invitation, and watches a show with no players. He turned to me abruptly. Watson, what do you make of puppets? I blinked. Puppets? Yes. Strings, painted faces, lifeless things that move by invisible design. You pull one thread and a whole cast dances. I suppose they're a metaphor for manipulation. Holmes nodded slowly. Indeed. And if this show was performed for no one, perhaps its purpose was not to entertain, but to declare control, to demonstrate a hand behind the curtain. I frowned. Then Bellamy was no mere victim. No, Holmes said softly. He was the audience. He turned away from me then, folding his coat tighter. But he was not the first, Holmes added. And though he offered no explanation, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night. Chapter 3. A scene of deception. The following morning was a quiet affair. A grey light slanted through the fog and into Baker Street, where Holmes stood with his back to the fire, staring at the violin resting in the corner like it might confess something if stared at long enough. He hadn't touched his breakfast. Instead, he had spread our small table with the few artifacts brought back from the Pavilion Theatre. Bellamy's crumpled invitation, the scrap of parchment found beneath his chair, a pair of opera glasses, and a solitary cufflink shaped like a chess pawn. I presume, I said, pouring a second cup of tea, that you took that from the deceased. I did not, Holmes replied. It was tucked behind the curtain rod, caught in a nest of string, precisely 13 feet above the puppet stage, out of reach from the floor. Why would a man lose a cufflink there? He didn't expect an answer, nor did I offer one. Holmes's mind was engaged in that eerie silence that always preceded his most extraordinary deductions. It was the silence of thought sculpting itself into form. By noon, We were back at the pavilion. The theatre had been swept of onlookers and sealed once again at Lestrade's request. Only a single constable guarded the front, clearly unnerved by the building's peculiar atmosphere. Holmes dismissed him with a nod and led me once more through the decrepit lobby, now tinged with a sour draught that smelled faintly of wax and damp velvet. As we entered the main hall, the air shifted. The puppet theatre still stood at center stage, untouched. Mr. Bellamy's seat had been vacated, but the outline of his presence, scuffed dust, a slight indentation in the padding, remained like a ghostly imprint. Holmes moved with quiet precision, his every footfall considered, his eyes alive with focus. "Watson," he said, "observe the dust along this aisle." I did. The carpet bore a jagged pattern where something or someone had disturbed the settled grime. The trail split near the fourth row, diverging toward opposite exits. "Two sets of movements," I said. "Someone entered, stopped, then left by a different path." "Correct. But note the spacing. One set of prints is heavier, the stride longer. The other is lighter, inconsistent, as if made by someone unsure of where to step. Or someone small." "Children?" He shook his head. "No children's footprints, but small shoes. Theater shoes, I'd wager. Soft-soled, for movement without sound." He pointed upward to the gantry above the stage, and this path leads us to the rear scaffolding, the same area where the cufflink was found. Someone was up there recently. They accessed it without stairs or ladder. Holmes tapped the wall beside the stage. I followed his gaze and saw a subtle seam in the wood paneling. With a firm press, the seam gave way. A disguised access panel swung inward on creaking hinges, revealing a cramped spiral staircase choked with dust and cobwebs. "Used only by crew," Holmes muttered. "And recently, by someone determined not to be seen." We ascended cautiously, the stairs groaning beneath our weight. The gantry above the stage was narrow and dizzying. From here, one could look directly down upon the puppet stage and the audience beyond. Holmes moved to a rotted crate near the curtain pulleys and knelt beside it. Something caught the light, a small brass crank attached to a box hidden beneath the wooden platform. He gave it a gentle turn. The puppet stage below responded. With a faint clicking, the puppets twitched. The jester's arm moved up. The tin soldier bowed. All of it operated via this single mechanical device, clockwork, elegant and old. Holmes raised his eyebrows. "So, our puppeteer was not backstage. He or she was up here, controlling the play in silence." He pointed to the crank's underside. "And here, a faint residue. Resin. The kind used to keep strings from slipping." I stepped back, the pieces shifting subtly in my mind. "So it wasn't truly a performance, was it? It was a mechanical display." "Ah," Holmes smiled thinly, "but all performances are mechanical to the right observer. What interests me is the intent. Why stage this? Why choose Bellamy?" He stood, eyes narrowing. "Let us return to the floor. There's something more deceptive in this scene. Something almost too perfect." We descended and made our way to the puppet stage. Holmes stepped behind it again, gently pushing aside the velvet curtains. This time he reached underneath the miniature theater's platform. His fingers found a false panel. With a flick, it opened to reveal a small compartment lined with soft felt. Inside was a single object, a marionette. But unlike the others, this one was different. Its face was hand-painted to resemble a real person, gaunt, with silver hair and a long, hooked nose. The clothes were far finer than the jester or soldier. This puppet wore a tiny tweed suit, and in its wooden hand it held a miniature book. Holmes stared at it, transfixed. "This," he said quietly, "is no character from folklore." I peered over his shoulder. "It looks like someone specific. Someone real." Holmes nodded. "A portrait. a likeness of Bellamy, carved in effigy. He turned it over. On the puppet's back, etched into the wood in precise lettering, were 3 words: Audience of 1. We stood in silence. Then Holmes placed the puppet carefully in a linen wrap from his coat. "This is no mere amusement, Watson. This is performance as punishment. The show wasn't for entertainment. It was for the condemned." He paused, scanning the empty seats. "And what's more, I believe Bellamy knew it. He came willingly, sat without protest. He was expected." We returned to the stage floor, and I noticed something peculiar beneath the footlights. A small scorch mark. Holmes knelt. "Ah, here's our final actor, or rather, the ghost of one." He scraped a sample into a vial. Magnesium powder, commonly used in flash photography, but in this case, possibly as a distraction or a signal. To whom? Holmes straightened. "That is what we must learn next." He turned to me, expression unreadable. "We must pay a visit to Ernest Bellamy's former publishing house. I suspect the pages of his past may contain the names of our present cast." "And if they do not?" I asked. "Then we must consider the darker possibility, that the play is not yet finished." Chapter 4. The gathering of suspects. The offices of Bellamy and Larch Publishing sat just off Chancery Lane, an old Georgian structure squeezed between 2 newer stone facades, as if time had passed it by but had not dared to push it down. It bore the scent of musty paper and fading ambition. Holmes and I were met at the door by a young man in wire spectacles who introduced himself, nervously, as Mr. Giles Winthrop, the firm's junior editor. "Mr. Bellamy was our founding partner," Winthrop explained as he led us past shelves of aging tomes. "Though he retired 3 years ago, his influence remained strong. He still selected manuscripts on occasion. Old habits die hard." "Was he here recently?" Holmes asked, eyes drifting across the corridor like a hound on a scent. "Just last week," Winthrop replied. "Came in rather suddenly, closed himself in his old office and requested that no one disturb him." "What did he do in that office?" I couldn't say. He kept the door shut. But afterward he gave a letter to Miss Carlyle, our archivist, and instructed her to seal it and send it to a Mr. Alton Tredlow." Holmes halted. "Tredlow?" Winthrop nodded. "Yes, a stage director, I believe. Bellamy spoke of him fondly, though I gathered they'd had a falling out some years ago." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "We'll need his address." Winthrop nodded quickly. "Of course." We were shown next to Bellamy's office, still preserved as he left it. A sturdy oak desk stood beneath tall windows, and the walls were lined with books. Stage plays, literary criticisms, bound journals of theatrical reviews. On the desk lay a single item, a photograph in a silver frame. Holmes picked it up and studied it. 4 figures stood side by side in front of an old theater. Bellamy, younger by a decade, smiled modestly beside a tall man with wild hair, a beautiful woman in a silk scarf, and a thin, spectacled fellow with a pipe. "Winthrop," Holmes asked, "do you recognize these people?" "The tall one is Mr. Tredlow. The woman, Miss Odette Linley, was an actress in his troupe, I believe. The 4th I'm not sure about. Possibly Mr. Felix Dunn, a playwright Bellamy published once." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "A curious gathering," he murmured. 4 souls bound by theatre. A publisher, a director, an actress, and a writer. A cast of sorts. He tapped the glass with his fingernail. "Watson, make a note. We are now chasing players from an old production, one Bellamy himself may have tried to forget." We took our leave and set out immediately to speak with Alton Tredlow, whose address lay near Chelsea, in a long terrace that overlooked the Thames. The door was opened by a housekeeper, who informed us that Mr. Tredlow was at home, though not altogether well. We were led to a drawing-room filled with theatrical memorabilia, faded posters, program notes, masks, and a curious collection of porcelain hands. Treadlow himself was seated in a high-backed armchair, swathed in a patchwork robe, his face pale and thin. His eyes, however, were alert, burning with the nervous energy of a man forever on the edge of performance. "Holmes," he said, rising with difficulty, "I hoped, prayed, even that you might come." "You received a letter from Bellamy," Holmes said, wasting no time. Treadlow nodded, sinking back into his chair. "A brief note, just 2 sentences. The past is rehearsing its final act. You must prepare for your cue." No signature, but the handwriting was his. I'd stake my career on it. Holmes paced slowly, his gaze never leaving the man. "You hadn't spoken in years. Why did he write to you now?" Treadlow hesitated. "We were once close. Collaborators. Friends, even. But things ended poorly. There was a production, years ago, one we never staged, The Audience of One, written by Felix Dunn. Bellamy was meant to publish it. Odette Linley was to star." He paused, swallowing hard. "But something happened," he said. "The script was pulled. Dunn vanished. Bellamy shut the entire project down. Said it was cursed." Holmes blinked slowly. "Cursed?" Treadlow gave a wan smile. "Not in the supernatural sense, Mr. Holmes, but something dark surrounded it. A rehearsal ended in violence. There was a fire. Bellamy hushed it up. Paid people to stay silent? We never spoke of it again." Holmes turned to me. "You recall the puppet with Bellamy's likeness? It bore the inscription, 'Audience of One.'" Treadlow paled visibly. "Someone is reviving that play," Holmes said. "Only now, the stage is not fiction, the theater is not illusion, and the audience is dying." Treadlow clutched the arms of his chair. "Odette still lives. She owns a flower shop in Kentish Town, but I haven't seen Dunn in over a decade." Holmes nodded. "We will visit her next." As we left the house, Holmes was unusually silent. At last he said, "This is no longer a mere murder. It is revenge, Watson, calculated and slow. Someone is casting old wounds into new roles." We arrived at Odette Linley's flower shop just as dusk began to settle. A wooden sign reading "Petals and Pantomime" swung gently in the wind. Inside, the air was filled with lavender, and the actress-turned-florist stood behind the counter, trimming stems with delicate fingers. She looked up with a start. "Odette Linley?" Holmes asked. She nodded, guarded. "I am Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We come on behalf of Ernest Bellamy." The scissors stopped. "Bellamy is dead," she said quietly. "I read it in the paper. I knew it would come to this." "To what, precisely?" Holmes pressed. She didn't answer at first. Then she turned and walked to a cabinet behind the counter. From it, she retrieved a box wrapped in silk. "He sent me this. 3 days before he died. I didn't open it. I was afraid." She handed it to Holmes. He unwrapped it carefully. Inside lay a porcelain mask, white with painted tears beneath both eyes. It was the same face carved into the marionette's wooden features. Odette whispered, "That mask was worn in The Audience of One." Holmes closed the lid. "Do you still have a copy of the script?" She hesitated. "There were only 4. One for each of us. I burned mine after the fire." Holmes turned to me. "Then we must find the remaining 2. Outside, the wind had begun to howl, the lamps flickered, and the street seemed quieter than usual. "Watson," Holmes said, voice low and urgent, "we are not uncovering a mystery. We are stepping into a performance already underway. The curtain has risen, and we, like the others, are now part of the cast." Chapter 5. The First Suspects. The Red Herring. We returned to Baker Street well past nightfall. Holmes lit the fire with unusual urgency and laid out the evening's discoveries like instruments on a surgical tray. The porcelain mask, the photograph, the puppet. Each was a symbol, not merely of the crime, but of a drama long buried. He stood by the window, fingers laced behind his back, watching the mist roll over the rooftops. "Watson," he said at last, "we have a quartet of players. Bellamy, now dead. Tredlow, the aging director. Odette Linley, brittle and afraid. And one Felix Dunn, our missing playwright. And you believe the culprit lies among them?" Holmes shook his head. "The trap is too perfect. Bellamy sat willingly in a condemned theater, knowing he would not rise again. No signs of struggle, no attempt to escape. That implies knowledge or guilt, which raises the possibility that the murder was not inflicted upon him, but provoked by him." I frowned. "You suspect suicide?" "No," Holmes said curtly. "Too elaborate, too theatrical. This was execution wrapped in stagecraft, but Bellamy consented to his own death. That is the key." We were interrupted by the sharp rap of boots on the stair. Lestrade entered, his face tense. "I've brought your suspects," he announced, stepping aside to allow 2 officers to enter behind him, each flanking a tall, hawk-nosed man in a disheveled brown coat. "Name's Isaac Penn," Lestrade said. "Security guard, or so he claimed. Caught him snooping outside the Pavilion Theater last night. Claims he's working for the city." The man stiffened. "I'm no criminal. I'm with the East End Sanitation Board. The theater's been on our watch list since January." "Then why?" Holmes asked coolly. "Were you at the scene of a sealed crime after midnight with lockpicks in your coat?" Penn's eyes narrowed. "Because something's wrong with that place. You think I'm the only one who hears things? People have been saying they see lights in the windows, shadows moving behind the curtain. No one's touched that building in months, yet someone's inside every night." Holmes approached slowly. "You believe in ghosts, Mr. Penn?" "I believe in unfinished business," he replied. "That place has a history. People disappeared there. The fire was just the beginning." Holmes studied him a moment longer, then turned to Lestrade. "Let him go." "What?" the inspector exclaimed. "The man had burglary tools. He also had dust on his shoes from a building condemned 3 months ago. He's telling the truth. He's a scavenger, not a murderer." Lestrade muttered something under his breath, but waved the constables off. Penn pulled his coat tight. "Don't say I didn't warn you. That building, it wants something." He vanished into the fog. Holmes returned to the fire. Now the theater itself becomes a character, a place of memory and manipulation. Whoever staged Bellamy's death knew its layout, its acoustics, and its emotional weight. Lestrade flopped into a chair. "Well, there's one more, a Mr. Theo Prendick, former prop master from the same company Bellamy sponsored in the late 80s. Our constables questioned him earlier, found him living in a tenement in Spitalfields, rambling about curses and puppet spells." "Is he mad?" I asked. "Quite possibly," Lestrade replied. "But he claimed Bellamy wasn't the first." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "The first what?" "Victim. According to Prendick, 2 others from the old troupe are already dead. One, a stagehand named Murray Hales, was found hanging in a barn last autumn, ruled a suicide. The other, a costume mistress named Beatrice Rowe, drowned in the Thames a month later." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, we need death records. Confirm these events. If true, the body count is rising behind the curtain, not before it." Lestrade lit a cigar. "Still looks like Bellamy was the central target. The others, coincidences maybe. Old stage people living hard lives. Or old debts being collected," Holmes said grimly, "in the form of roles reprised." He crossed to the bookshelf, retrieving a leather-bound theater almanac. "Ah, here it is. The Audience of One by Felix Dunn. Never published. Staged only once for rehearsal. Cancelled mid-production. No surviving script." He turned the page and tapped it. Cast list: the Watcher, the Puppet Master, the Harlequin, and the Blind Queen. Symbolic roles. Archetypes, not names. Sounds like nonsense, Lestrade grumbled. Holmes looked up. It is nonsense, Inspector, but the structured kind. Ritual disguised as art. And in such plays, the casting is everything. I rose from my chair. If Bellamy was the puppet master, as you suspect, then who among the others fits the remaining roles? Holmes smiled faintly. Tredlow watches. Odette is blind to what's coming. And the Harlequin, he paused, may still be waiting to take the stage. A silence followed. Then Holmes turned briskly. We must find Felix Dunn. He is the missing piece, the only one not accounted for. If he is alive, then he is either the author of this unfolding tragedy or its final victim. Assuming he wants to be found, I said. Holmes nodded, which he does not. He moved to the door, coat already in hand. To the archives, Watson. We must learn what became of Mr. Dunn after the curtain first fell. It may be the only way to stop the final act before the last audience disappears. Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. A hidden inconsistency. It was just past noon when Holmes and I arrived at the Public Records Office, a grey stone structure that loomed beside the embankment like an archivist's mausoleum. The scent of ink and time hung thick in the air, and behind the counter stood a clerk who moved with the mechanical grace of a man who had not been surprised in years. Holmes approached the desk with the quiet confidence of a man who had walked this path 100 times. Death records, he said simply. One Murray Hales, stagehand formerly employed at the Pavilion Theatre, alleged suicide in Spitalfields, autumn of last year. And Beatrice Rowe, costume mistress, drowned in the Thames sometime this past spring. I require copies of both entries, cause of death, investigative remarks, and location of discovery. The clerk blinked. And your authorization? Holmes produced a folded paper from his coat. The seal of the Yard, borrowed no doubt from one of Lestrade's less attentive subordinates. Within minutes, we were seated at a long wooden table, 2 thin files opened before us. Holmes examined the first with clinical calm. Murray Hales, he murmured. Age 52. Found in a barn loft outside Shoreditch. Hanging, no sign of struggle. Police ruled it self-inflicted. No family, no witnesses. Body discovered by a landlord seeking unpaid rent. I glanced at the file. Rather bleak. Holmes made a sound in his throat. Look here, Watson. No rope burns on the hands. No signs of ligature resistance. Neck broken at the 3rd vertebra. Instantaneous. Most hangings, particularly by amateurs, result in strangulation, not fracture. That suggests someone with knowledge of execution. He pushed the file aside. Now, Beatrice Rowe, he said, opening the second. Her record was thinner. Female, 46. Found in the shallows beneath Blackfriars Bridge. No signs of violence. Water in lungs confirmed drowning. Classified as accidental, possibly intoxicated. Holmes narrowed his eyes. Yet here again, no personal effects, no purse, no coat, no identification on the body. She was discovered only because a nearby florist recognized her from a poster in his shop window. A tragic coincidence, I offered. Holmes shook his head. No, a stage, a performance, carefully set. He flipped back to the page listing the clothing found on Beatrice's body. A long dress, threadbare slippers, and in the pocket, one ticket stub. Holmes tapped it. Here. A ticket to the Pavilion Theatre. Not from last week. From 10 years ago. I leaned closer. Perhaps she kept it as a memento. Holmes stared at the page as if it were whispering. No, he said quietly. It was planted, a signature left for those who knew to look. He closed both files and stood abruptly. Watson, we must return to the theatre. But what for? There is something I missed, something hiding in plain sight. Our murderer is not improvising. He is staging a revival, which means the play itself may be his blueprint. We arrived at the pavilion by late afternoon. The constable at the gate was new, green around the ears and terrified of the place. He let us in with trembling hands. Inside, the gloom had grown heavier. Dust lay thicker. The silence now felt oppressive, like the house was listening. Holmes wasted no time. He moved to the puppet theatre and, for the first time, examined its underside. Not the stage, nor the compartment where we'd found the puppet of Bellamy, but the very base of the miniature structure. With careful fingers, he peeled away a section of the crimson velvet skirt. There, stitched into the black felt backing, was a row of tiny initials, MBATFLFD, embroidered with threads so faded it might have been mistaken for wear. I leaned in. Bellamy, Tredlow, Linley, Felix Dunn. Holmes nodded. And now, Bellamy is dead. Dunn is missing. That leaves two. He stood, dusting off his hands. Watson, recall what Lestrade told us. Penn said there were lights seen moving behind the curtain, but there's no electricity in the theatre. Then how? Because someone installed gas piping, illegally, which I saw but did not register. He led me backstage to the far left wing where a tangle of old canvas and broken set pieces lay heaped like corpses. Pulling them aside, Holmes exposed a narrow panel behind the wall. Within it, copper piping snaked upward into the rafters. Whoever is operating this space, he said, has been here often enough to rebuild portions of it. Rehearsal, Watson. Ritual. This is no crime of opportunity. It's a production with an obsessive director. He stood in silence a moment, then said something I did not expect. We must split paths. I want you to visit Tredlow again. Ask him if he still has the original set notes, the director's blocking instructions, anything that survived the collapse of the original production. Why? Because something is amiss. This puppet stage was built to mirror the original set, but one element doesn't belong. He gestured to the puppet arrangement. The tin soldier, the maiden, the harlequin, the king. One of these, Holmes said, was not in the original play. How do you know? He gave a tight smile. Because I noticed it move on its own. I stared at him. Holmes lowered his voice. Only slightly. The strings are all connected to the same crank, but one puppet shifted after the mechanism had stopped. That means it's not connected. It was placed manually, added later. Which one? The king. I stared again at the carved face of the crowned figure. Severe, impassive, eyes narrowed in judgment. An inserted symbol, Holmes said. One that doesn't fit the play's original structure. That's our inconsistency. Someone has rewritten the story, mid-performance. We stood in silence as the weight of that statement settled. Then Holmes turned. Go to Tredlow, now. Find out what he remembers about the staging. I will return to Odette. If I'm correct, she's received another message. As I stepped into the gathering dusk, the weight of the theatre fell away like a heavy cloak. I could not shake the feeling that, despite the dead man, despite the abandoned building, the play was still happening. Not past tense, but present. As though somewhere in the city, someone was pulling strings and writing lines, using lives as props and vengeance as stagecraft, and we, Holmes and I, had yet to read the final scene. Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. When I arrived at the modest home of Charles Tredlow on Cartwright Lane, a storm was gathering above London. The wind tugged at the corners of my coat, and the sky, bruised and swollen with clouds, seemed to brood over the city like a curtain awaiting its final drop. Tredlow greeted me with a weariness that had not been present during our first visit. His eyes, sunken and shadowed, had the look of a man lately burdened with unwelcome recollections. I received your telegram, he said, ushering me inside. Some, though I admit I don't know why Holmes believes I can be of help. I've told you all I remember. I followed him through a narrow corridor cluttered with books and yellowing theatre bills. He led me into a study that smelled faintly of mothballs and soot. Upon a battered desk lay a stack of folders, their edges curled with age. Holmes' instincts had not failed. "I'm here," I said gently, "because Holmes believes there is a discrepancy between the puppet arrangement at the theatre and the original production. He wants to know if you still have any of the set designs, particularly the blocking notes, prop lists, or stage directions." Treadlow sank into a chair, staring at the folders. "I've not opened these in years," he murmured. After Felix Dunn vanished, I could scarcely bear to look at them, but perhaps... He opened the top folder. Inside were penciled diagrams, annotated scripts, and dog-eared photographs of the stage from various angles. "Here," he said after a moment. This was the central tableau. The curtain closed on this scene each night. We called it the Court of Masks. I examined the sketch. 5 puppets. A harlequin, a blindfolded lady holding scales, a hooded jester, a little girl in a crown of thorns, and a soldier with broken limbs. No king. "No monarch figure?" I asked. Treadlow shook his head. "No. The play's message, if you can call it that, was about chaos, justice, and innocence defiled. The king would have contradicted the tone entirely. No, that's not ours." "Holmes suspected as much," I said quietly. "Someone has altered the tableau, not just to revisit the past, but to rewrite it." Treadlow stared at the image, then looked up at me with a haunted expression. "Then this person, whoever they are, knows more than they should. Those scripts were never published. Only 6 copies existed, and all were returned to the director after closing. Who had access? Bellamy, myself, Dunn, Beatrice Rowe, and the set carpenter, Murray Hales. I felt a shiver despite the warmth of the room. 2 dead. 1 missing, I murmured, and 1 receiving anonymous puppets. Treadlow closed the folder with a decisive snap. "If you're right, Dr. Watson," he said grimly, "then this isn't merely a series of killings. It's a reenactment, a resurrection of the play's ending, but with real blood." By the time I returned to Baker Street, the storm had broken, sending great sheets of rain slashing against the windows. I found Holmes not in his usual position by the hearth, but instead standing at the window, arms crossed, watching the street with unreadable focus. "There was another message," he said without turning. "From Odette?" "No." He turned and handed me a small envelope, damp from the messenger's glove. "This arrived not 10 minutes after you left Treadlow's." I opened it. There was no writing, only a single item, a puppet's hand carved from pale wood, stained at the wrist with what looked like red paint. "Paint?" I asked. Holmes gave me a long look. "Blood." The silence between us thickened. "It was delivered directly?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "By a boy, 8 or 9, paid to run it from an alley in Whitechapel. He didn't see the sender." "Then this is a warning?" "No," Holmes said. "It's an announcement. A hand removed from a puppet signifies control relinquished. Whoever this is, he is signaling a shift. The next act has begun." He sat down and lit his pipe, the match flaring against the dark. "Your journey to Treadlow," he prompted. I gave him the details. The missing king, the original tableau, the restricted access to the scripts. When I mentioned the carpenter's involvement, Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Murray Hales," he murmured. "Hung in a barn outside Shoreditch. Quiet man. No surviving family. No obituary. You think he didn't kill himself?" Holmes tapped ash into the tray. "I think he was retired from the stage, Watson. Permanently." The phrase sent a chill through me. I turned back to the puppet hand, now resting on Holmes's desk like a grim prop from a child's nightmare. "And Odette?" I asked. "She's left London," Holmes replied. "Gone to stay with family in Kent." I advised it. "You think she was next?" "I think she was already part of the play," he said, exhaling smoke. "But not in the role she believes." Later that evening, as I prepared to retire, a final knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson, visibly shaken, handed Holmes a note that had been pushed through the letterbox moments earlier. No sound, no knock, just the paper sliding like a whisper across the floor. Holmes read it silently, then passed it to me. In delicate cursive, a single line. "What is a play without an audience?" There was no signature, no address. Just below the writing, scrawled in black charcoal, was a tiny stage, complete with curtains and 5 stick figures. 4 were upright. The 5th was hanging from a noose. I looked to Holmes. His face was unreadable, but his hands, always steady, had gone still. "It's a provocation," I said. "No," Holmes murmured. "It's an invitation." We sat in silence for some time, the rain playing a staccato rhythm on the windows. The fog had thickened across the city, wrapping London in a theatrical gloom. But there was no audience here, only Holmes and me, and somewhere out there, the director, waiting for his curtain to rise. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. It was just past 10 in the morning when Holmes returned from an unannounced excursion. His coat damp from dew, a smudge of ash on his sleeve, and a distant gleam in his eye that I had come to recognize as a herald of mischief, or revelation, often both. Without a word, he removed his gloves, placed a crumpled paper bag on the breakfast table, and poured himself a cup of lukewarm tea. I regarded him from across the room. "Well?" I asked. He looked up absently. "Do you recall the phrasing of the note delivered last evening? 'What is a play without an audience?'" I quoted, along with a childish drawing of a stage and 5 figures, one hanged. "Indeed," he murmured, sipping his tea. "Now why 5? Why not 6? Why not the full cast, if this were mere dramatization?" "Because only 5 are being targeted," I said. "Those connected to the original production. Good. Very good." He reached for the bag and withdrew a small carved figure. It was a crude marionette, its limbs jointed, its face half-painted. I recognized it instantly. "It's the Harlequin," I said. "An exact replica of the one found posed on the theater stage," Holmes confirmed. "But this one is not from the Strand. I purchased it this morning from a woodcarver near Spitalfields. Name of Kershaw. An old Romany artisan whose memory, fortunately, has not yet succumbed to age." He produced a second puppet, a blindfolded lady with scales, and placed it beside the Harlequin. Kershaw was the original artisan hired by Felix Dunn to craft the show's figures. He kept the prototypes, never returned. Most assumed they were discarded. He laid out 3 more, the hooded jester, the thorn-crowned girl, and the broken-limbed soldier. "They're beautiful," I murmured. "They are also," Holmes said sharply, "not the same puppets used in the recent tableau." I looked up. "Each of the figures at the Strand was heavier," he continued. "Crafted from oak, not linden. Their joints are less refined. The faces, subtly altered. It is not simply a recreation, it is a replacement. A reimagining." "Then whoever is doing this didn't have access to the originals," I said slowly, "or deliberately chose to alter them." "Precisely. Which tells us that the killer is not merely enacting a memory. He's revising it, directing it differently. There is an editorial hand at work. And directors," he added, "have a very particular psychology." I was about to press him further when there came a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson appeared, announcing that Miss Beatrice Rowe had arrived, looking pale, wet from the rain, and in a state of distress. When she entered, I barely recognized her. Her posture, so regal at the Strand, was now hunched and brittle. Her gloved hands trembled. "Mr. Holmes, I shouldn't have come," she said, eyes darting nervously to the window. "But something's happened. Something's changed." Holmes gestured for her to sit. "This morning," she whispered, "there was another puppet on my windowsill, but not like the others." She reached into her handbag and with visible reluctance produced the figure. It was smaller than the others, less defined. It had no face. Its limbs were tied with red string. Holmes took it gently, examining the knots with a magnifying glass. "A votive," he murmured. "Crude, almost ritualistic. These bindings, look closely, Watson, are made from theatre curtain rope, torn from a velvet drop." Beatrice shuddered. "There was a note as well," she said. "No envelope this time. Just pinned to the doll's chest." Holmes unfolded it. The handwriting was the same delicate cursive as before. "You forgot your final cue, Beatrice. But the stage remembers." No one spoke for a moment. "Miss Rowe," Holmes said at last, "do you recall ever speaking ill of Felix Dunn in public? Or in private letters?" She blinked, startled. "No, never." "And yet, you left the play just 2 weeks before its final performance. Some said it was creative differences. Others hinted at arguments." She lowered her eyes. "He frightened me. He was brilliant, yes, but volatile. After each show he would stand backstage, muttering lines that weren't in the script, whispering names under his breath. Some evenings he didn't even seem to know who we were." "Names?" I asked. "Obscure ones, biblical, mythic. He called Tredlow Judas. Me, he called Lilith." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "Did he ever call himself something?" She swallowed. "Once, the night before I left, he cornered me in the wings. His eyes were wild. He said, 'The king is dead. Long live the king. I am both now.'" She shook her head. "I told the others. No one believed me." Holmes stood, moving to the window. "And yet now," he murmured, "a new king appears on stage, a puppet unaccounted for in the original script, a figure of power, uninvited." Beatrice looked up, tears forming. "Mr. Holmes, I'm not mad, am I?" "No," he said gently, "but someone is trying very hard to make you think you are." That afternoon, Holmes made a quiet visit to Scotland Yard. When he returned, he appeared less triumphant than usual, something between irritation and grim satisfaction. "They're preparing an arrest," he announced. "For whom?" I asked. "Charles Tredlow." My stomach dropped. Surely not. He was seen at the theatre 2 nights before the first crime, claiming he was conducting research for a new production. No one can corroborate it. "But that's hardly—" "There's more," Holmes interrupted. "His fingerprints were found on one of the puppets." "Of course they were," I said, exasperated. "He built them." "Exactly." Holmes sat, steepling his fingers. "This is what I feared. A convenient suspect, a tidy explanation, an emotionally unstable artist, reliving a past failure, exacting vengeance." "You don't believe it?" "I believe," Holmes said darkly, "that we are being given a culprit, fed a performance. This, Watson, is an illusion crafted for an audience that doesn't know it's watching." "And what do you intend to do?" He smiled faintly. "I intend to break the fourth wall." Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. It was not yet dawn when Holmes roused me from uneasy sleep. He stood over my bed, coat already buttoned, boots damp from the street. "We must go," he said. "There's been another message." Bleary-eyed, I sat up. "Another puppet?" He shook his head. "Worse. Inspector Lestrade wired me not half an hour ago. Tredlow is missing. Disappeared from his flat sometime after midnight. There was a note and blood. Within the hour, we were rattling through the fog-veiled streets of Fitzrovia in a hansom cab, Holmes grim and silent beside me, his fingers interlaced tightly beneath his chin. "Is the theatre still guarded?" I asked. "By 2 uniformed men," he replied, "but that is not where I believe the next act will take place." We arrived at Charles Tredlow's apartment just as the first light broke the horizon, throwing long, pale shafts across Charlotte Street. A pair of constables stood outside the narrow townhouse, their expressions rigid. Inside, Lestrade waited, his mustache twitching in irritation. He held a crumpled envelope. "Left on the kitchen table," he said, handing it to Holmes. "No sign of forced entry, but this—" He gestured toward the narrow hallway beyond. "This is what concerns me." Holmes opened the envelope as we stepped inside. The note, again in the same elegant hand, read, "1 puppet down, 4 more to bow. The director thanks you for your blindness." A chill prickled the back of my neck. Lestrade led us into the kitchen. There, smeared across the tiled floor, was a dark trail of blood, leading to the back door, left slightly ajar. "No body?" Holmes asked, kneeling to examine the marks. "None," Lestrade said. "But that much blood. He can't have gone far, or lived long." Holmes remained silent, his gaze shifting from the smudges on the floor to a cracked teacup near the sink. "Only 1 cup," he muttered. "He was alone. Unless," I said, "he never expected company." Holmes's eyes flashed. He rose swiftly. "Watson, the back alley. Come." We followed the blood trail out through the yard, where it vanished into wet cobblestone. There were no footprints, just a faint scuff, like a box had been dragged. Holmes studied the fence, then ran a hand along a splintered rail. "Fresh," he murmured. "Someone scaled this in haste. And recently." We returned inside, where Lestrade awaited news of our grim discovery. Holmes, however, said nothing of note, only that the case was still unfolding. As we exited the building, I caught the inspector by the sleeve. "You'll post guards at the theatre?" I asked. "We've doubled them," Lestrade assured. "But if Tredlow's done something to himself, or someone's done it to him, it won't be at the Strand." "I wouldn't be so sure," I muttered. By mid-morning, Holmes and I stood once again within the darkened shell of the burned-out Strand Theatre. The scent of old smoke and rotted velvet lingered like a trapped memory. "Why return here?" I asked. "Because the killer has not finished his script," Holmes replied, "and because he is not simply eliminating the cast. He is staging something. There is meaning in the setting." He moved swiftly now, scanning the rafters, the rigging, the shattered orchestra pit. "I found this yesterday," he said, producing a folded playbill from the week before the accident. 5 names circled in red ink: Dunn, Rowe, Tredlow, Harrogate, and Eliza Bell. "The original cast," I said. "Not quite. 1 name is missing. Philip Merewether. He was replaced shortly before the final curtain." Holmes strode toward the backstage stairwell. "There is a motive here, Watson, but it is buried beneath layers of performance. Each act is a message. Each puppet a cipher. We must learn to read it before the final cue." Suddenly, from above, a sound. Creak, creak, snap. Holmes grabbed my shoulder and pulled me back as a weight dropped from the rafters with a sickening thud. It was a body. Not a dummy. Not a puppet. A man. He hung by the neck from a thick velvet rope tied to the catwalk. A crude wooden mask had been placed over his face, the same blank countenance as the faceless puppet Beatrice had shown us. Lestrade's men, summoned by whistle, were there within minutes. One climbed the ladder to cut the body down. The mask came off in the descent. It was Tredlow. Or what was left of him. The bruises on his wrists suggested he'd been bound, his fingernails broken, likely clawing at the mask. A note was pinned to his chest. He forgot his lines. The audience does not forgive. Lestrade paled. It's madness, pure madness. Holmes crouched over the body. He lifted the man's arm, then nodded. Post-mortem bruising. He was killed hours before the hanging. This was a performance, nothing more. A warning? I asked. No, Holmes replied. A distraction. The killer is accelerating. He fears the curtain is about to drop, and he hasn't delivered his finale. But why Treadlow? I said. He was only a puppet maker. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Which is precisely why. The puppets are not just symbols. They are the medium, and he, Treadlow, was the only other man capable of making them. He straightened slowly. And now, Watson, now the killer is the sole craftsman left in the theater. Later that night, we returned to Baker Street. The fire crackled low, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Holmes sat motionless for nearly an hour, eyes closed, fingertips pressed together. Then abruptly, he rose. I need to speak to Miss Rowe again, he said. But not as myself. He disappeared into his bedroom. When he emerged 20 minutes later, he was an entirely different man, a weary, soft-spoken constable with fading sideburns and a provincial accent. You will accompany me, he said, and speak as you normally would. Let her believe you're alone. Watch her eyes when I enter. For what? For recognition, he said, or fear. Either will do. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. There is an unspoken tension that precedes a revelation, the kind that coils in silence just before a curtain is drawn or a mask removed. It was precisely that tension I felt as I stood once more before the weather-worn doorway of Beatrice Rowe's Bloomsbury residence, Holmes walking 2 steps behind me, his disguise immaculate. The plan was simple. I would knock, I would talk. Holmes would enter a moment later, posing as a new officer assigned to the case. He believed Miss Rowe was hiding something. Perhaps not guilt, but fear or knowledge too dangerous to share in open light. She answered quickly this time, her dark eyes still shadowed by grief or exhaustion. I could not tell. Dr. Watson, she said with a faint smile. I hadn't expected you so soon. I'm afraid the situation has worsened, I said gently. Treadlow has been found. Dead. Her hands flew to her mouth. No. Holmes watched from behind me. His voice altered as he stepped forward. Detective Sergeant Pine, miss. May I? Beatrice hesitated. Her gaze lingered on Holmes, only briefly, but long enough for me to catch the shift in her pupils. Not recognition, perhaps, but familiarity. She nodded him in. We sat in the drawing room, its walls lined with books and playbills. Her eyes kept returning to the grate, where the last embers of the fire still glowed. Holmes waited silently, as if his presence were incidental. I don't understand, she said after a moment. Why Charles? He was harmless. He barely left his shop. Did he ever mention being afraid? I asked. Or receiving anything unusual? She hesitated. A letter, perhaps. Last week. He showed it to me briefly. A riddle or something. He thought it was a prank. Said it was in character. In character. Yes, she said, brow furrowed. He said it felt like something out of a script he'd once read. About vengeance. A performer returned from disgrace. Holmes cleared his throat. Miss Rowe, did the name Philip Merewether mean anything to you? Her face changed. She looked down. I was afraid someone would ask about him, she whispered. He was in the production, the original cast, rehearsed for weeks, then just disappeared. Disappeared? He was dismissed, quietly. There was an incident, something backstage, before opening night. A row with Dunn. I never learned the details. Merewether never came back. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And what was his role? He was to play the stage master, a sort of chorus figure, one who manipulated the fate of the others. Holmes leaned back, his voice flat. And now someone is doing precisely that. Beatrice looked from Holmes to me. Do you think... is it him? Philip? We're not certain, I said carefully. But it would explain his absence after the fire. Was he ever blamed? She shook her head. There was a rumor, but nothing proven. He was gone before the final week. No one saw him again. Holmes stood. Thank you, Miss Rowe. You've been most helpful. I expect someone from the yard will return shortly with more formal questions. Beatrice looked up, confused. But I thought you were... She stopped. Holmes removed the cap and mustache with a faint smile. You tricked me, she said, not angrily, but with a mixture of admiration and resignation. Holmes bowed. Forgive the artifice. The truth, Miss Rowe, often hides behind a mask, and I feared your honesty would do the same. Outside, Holmes wasted no time. Philip Merewether is either our murderer or our ghost, he said. We must know which. And if he died in the fire? I asked. Holmes shook his head. No body was ever recovered, only the assumption that he had fled London, but there is a deeper layer still. He tapped the side of his head. The play, the actual play, what was it called? The Exit Rehearsal, I replied. Find the script, Holmes said. The full script, not the performance version. Tredlow would have had a copy, perhaps Rowe as well. Or Harrogate. I must know the ending. That afternoon, we visited Percival Harrogate, the brooding tragedian who had thus far managed to avoid the storm. He lived in a flat above a tobacconist on Holloway Road, curtained windows, black-stained fingertips, and a voice like crushed velvet. You're too late, he said, before we even introduced ourselves. The theatre is cursed, and we, those of us who stood upon that stage, were marked the moment we spoke its final line. Holmes wasted no time. Do you have a copy of the original script? Harrogate raised a brow. What, the exit rehearsal? I burned mine, first night after the fire. Then you remember it? He looked up reluctantly. It was brilliant, he said. Mad, but brilliant. A play within a play. About actors who learn their lives are being scripted by a mysterious figure, a puppeteer of sorts. One by one, they resist their lines, and one by one, they vanish. Did the script have a conclusion? Holmes asked. Harrogate shook his head. No one ever saw the final scene. The playwright, Elliot Garnett, never finished it. Or if he did, he took it to his grave. Elliot Garnett? I asked. The name doesn't ring. He died the day before we opened, Harrogate said. Collapsed in his study. Heart failure, they said. His body was found next to a single page. It read only, "The performance continues, even in absence." Holmes's gaze darkened. Absence, he said softly, like a man presumed dead, but still directing the play. That evening, Holmes and I returned to Baker Street. The lamplight flickered as he paced the room. The facts align too closely for mere coincidence, he said. A missing actor. A script about manipulation and vengeance. A string of murders echoing a theatrical performance, and now a reference to a missing final scene. He stopped by the fireplace and looked at me. I believe the murders are not just symbolic, Watson. They are rehearsed. Each death echoes a scene never performed. We are watching a madman complete the script in real life. But who? I asked. Merewether. Garnett returned from the grave? Holmes shook his head. We've missed something. A name, a motive, a relationship. Someone who knew the script intimately, yet remained invisible. He moved to his desk and opened the portfolio of notes. From a sleeve, he withdrew the first puppet, found in the alley. He turned it over. Inside the back seam, I saw it then, faint inked letters. Scene 4, the forgotten voice. Not a message, Holmes whispered. A script note. He looked up at me. They're following the script, Watson. Scene by scene. Death by death. Chapter 11. The Bait, Holmes' Grand Strategy. There are moments when Holmes becomes entirely removed from the world, a state in which his mind operates as though through some unseen apparatus. During such spells, he does not speak unless spoken to, he does not eat unless prompted, and he most certainly does not sleep. For 3 hours after discovering the hidden inscription on the puppet, he stood at the window of our Baker Street lodgings, unmoving, the flickering gas lights of the city catching faint glints in his eyes. Scene A4, he murmured at last, the forgotten voice. We've just witnessed Scene 5 with Tredlow's death, and the puppet marked it accordingly. I was seated across the room, nursing a brandy and the remnants of my patience. You believe there's a fixed structure to these killings? Not believe, Watson, no. Our murderer is not improvising. He is staging a performance exactly as it was meant to be played. The original script, unfinished as it was, seems to live on in his mind. Or perhaps... Holmes stopped. Perhaps he's written it. That sent a chill down my spine. You mean, he isn't just acting it out, he's completing it? Holmes nodded once, sharply. He sees himself as the director, Watson, the playwright of death, which means his next move is already written. He crossed the room in a few long strides and pulled a volume from his personal files. A thick folder marked Garnet, E. Inside were scattered references, interviews, and production notes Holmes had been collecting over the past day. Scene 6, he whispered. We must anticipate it. I watched as he flipped rapidly through the pages. Then he paused, eyes fixed on a grainy photograph, an old playbill for the exit rehearsal listing the cast in order of appearance. Beatrice Rowe, Tredlow, Harrowgate, and then Basil Courtwright, Holmes read aloud. Stage manager, an off-stage role but essential to every production. He was responsible for props, lighting, and ensuring smooth transitions. I squinted at the name. He hasn't come up yet. No, but he's on the list, and if our murderer is moving through the cast chronologically, Courtwright is next. Holmes snapped the file shut. Then we must make him bait. We found Basil Courtwright the next morning at a modest boarding house in Clerkenwell. A pale, bony man in his 60s. He seemed shocked to see us, and even more so when Holmes informed him he was being targeted. Targeted? Me? He cried, holding his robe tight around his narrow chest. I haven't seen any of them in years. That may be so, Holmes replied, but to the man behind these murders, your role in that play makes you next. Courtwright's trembling hand went to his brow. I was only backstage. I never even read the full script. Holmes gave a tight smile. Which makes you perfect. He turned to me. Watson, we shall stage a death. By evening, everything was arranged. Scotland Yard had agreed, reluctantly, to assist in a controlled deception. At Holmes's instruction, Basil Courtwright would be discovered in a mock crime scene at his lodgings, his throat slashed, his puppet hung above the bed, red ink scattered like blood. Holmes orchestrated the scene with a director's precision. Every detail, the angle of the chair, the placement of the papers, the broken mirror on the floor, was meticulously composed. This, Holmes said as he surveyed the room, is Scene 6. We are giving our villain what he expects. But why? I asked. Won't this encourage him to strike again? That is the idea, Holmes said softly. Now that he believes his rehearsal is continuing unimpeded, he will grow bolder, more reckless. He turned toward the puppet, which now hung limply from the doorknob. Holmes had tucked something into its hollow frame, a slip of paper I had not seen. What did you hide in there? An invitation, he said. One only our playwright will understand. By midnight, the press had the story. Third theater death, Puppeteer strikes again. The trap had been set. We returned to Baker Street in silence, though I could feel Holmes's mind working feverishly beneath his outward calm. "You do realize," I said cautiously, "that if this fails, we may provoke another real death?" Holmes nodded, but his expression did not waver. "That is why," he said, "we shall not let it fail." Chapter 12. The moment of recognition. 2 days passed. Basil Courtwright, still very much alive, remained sequestered at a secure location arranged by Inspector Lestrade. The newspapers ran amok with theories, embellishing the tale of the puppeteer of Curtain Lane with a mixture of awe and gleeful speculation. Meanwhile, Holmes paced the sitting room like a wolf hemmed in by furniture. He refused company, he refused food, and, more disturbingly to me, he had gone nearly silent. The silence broke late on the second evening. I was dozing in my armchair when Holmes let out a sharp sound. Not quite a shout, not quite a laugh. "Of course," he murmured, "it was never about who. It was about when." I stirred. "What do you mean?" He paced once more, hands behind his back. "Every one of these scenes, the puppets, the inscriptions, the order of the victims, they give the appearance of a deliberate progression, scene by scene, like a written play, and we believed quite naturally that the murderer was enacting the original script Garnett had penned. Was that not the case?" He turned toward the window. The gaslight lit his sharp profile from the side, casting one eye in shadow. "No, Watson. Garnett's play was unfinished. The last scenes were never written, only hinted at." I recalled the description Inspector Galt had shared. The final acts had been referred to in journals, even discussed in interviews, but no surviving version had been located. "So the killer is improvising?" "Not quite. He's completing it, filling in the blanks from memory or invention. But he's doing it with strict logic. Each victim has a line to the structure of the production. It's theatrical madness with internal order." I frowned. "Then how does that help us?" Holmes turned to me, his eyes electric. "Because if we understand the final act, Watson, we understand his endgame." Holmes pulled from his desk a tattered copy of the exit rehearsal, annotated in pencil. He had borrowed it from Galt's office, and now he flipped to the marginalia, scribbles of Garnett's thoughts, potential endings, stray character notes. "This," Holmes said, pointing to a nearly illegible sentence scrawled along the inside cover. "This is what I overlooked." I leaned in. The sentence read, "Curtain call without an audience. The actor unmasks himself." Holmes tapped the line with a finger. "The curtain call, Watson. That is the finale. And who takes the final bow? The lead?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Precisely. The lead. But not in the traditional sense. You see, there is no clear main character in the first acts. Tredlow, Rowe, Harrowgate, even Courtwright. They are supporting roles. Functionaries. Then who is left? Only one person would view himself as the protagonist of Garnett's vision, the one who controls the stage, writes the lines, and demands applause from no one. He looked up at me. The director. It struck me with force. "You believe the killer was not merely involved in the original production, he was its creator. Or rather, its recreator. Someone who saw Garnett's unfinished work not as a relic, but as a divine script left to him alone. Someone who believed he had been chosen to complete the play." I sat back. "But who?" Holmes was silent for a moment. Then, "Only one man had access to Garnett's journals. Only one man has reappeared now, after nearly a decade of silence. Only one man who was never officially involved in the production, yet obsessed with every detail of it." I blinked. "You mean Galt?" Holmes gave a single nod. "But he's an inspector." "A self-made one," Holmes said softly. "Appointed late, after years of obscurity." Did it not strike you as odd that Galt had an encyclopedic knowledge of an obscure, unfinished play? Or that he had access to a puppet before it was officially discovered? No, Galt is not an observer. He is the playwright. The room seemed suddenly colder. Then the trap has already sprung, Holmes said. He took the bait, but I suspect he's planning the finale even now. He moved to the door, snatching his coat. Where are you going? I asked, rising. To the theatre, he replied. To the only place a man like Galt could imagine staging his final act. Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape. We arrived at the abandoned theatre on Lichfield Street just past midnight. The sky loomed low and oppressive, fog curling like smoke through the crooked alleyways of Soho. Holmes moved swiftly, his steps silent on the damp cobblestones. I followed, my revolver tucked inside my coat, though it gave me little comfort. The theatre's boarded doors had been pried open. Holmes stepped through without hesitation. Wait, I whispered. If Galt truly is behind this. He won't run, Holmes murmured. Not yet. He believes he has one last scene to perform. Inside, the theatre was cloaked in shadow and dust. A few broken seats remained in the orchestra stalls, and the faded scent of grease paint lingered in the air. Holmes lit a lantern, casting long, flickering shadows across the cracked proscenium. We moved toward the stage. It was then that we heard it, a faint, creaking sound, rhythmic and hollow, like wood straining against metal. We paused, listening. It came again. Holmes raised the lantern and directed the beam toward the curtain. And there he was. On the stage stood a figure hunched over a puppet stand, his back to us. The gleam of the lantern caught in the polished surface of something grotesque, rows of wooden marionettes dangling lifelessly from threads. Their painted eyes stared into the void, as if waiting for instruction. Inspector Galt, Holmes said calmly. The figure did not flinch. I must congratulate you, Holmes continued, stepping forward. Your staging has been impeccable, but your play has reached its final act. The man turned slowly. Even in the dim light, I could see the transformation. Galt's expression was no longer that of the stern, taciturn inspector. It was rapturous, eyes wide, fevered with intensity, lips parted in a grin far too broad to be sane. It was never my play, he whispered. It was his. Garnett's. I merely delivered it to the world. You rewrote it, Holmes said. I restored it, Galt snapped. He told me how it should end. He showed me. His notes, his drawings, they were prophecy. This world forgot him. I did not. Holmes's voice was low and steady. You killed 5 people, Galt. They weren't people, he said, gesturing to the puppets. They were characters, and I needed them to be seen. I made them immortal. He began to reach into his coat. Holmes stiffened. I moved my hand to my revolver, but instead of a weapon, Galt drew out a folded sheet of paper. It was yellowed, stained at the edges. He held it aloft like a priest with a relic. The final scene, he murmured. Written in Garnett's own hand. I found it tucked behind the mirror in the dressing room. He finished it, Holmes. He finished it, but no one looked. Holmes stepped closer. What does it say? Galt's eyes gleamed. It says the stage burns, and the puppet master vanishes. In that instant, I caught the shimmer of movement. His free hand darted behind the puppet stand. Holmes lunged. There was a sudden burst of smoke and light. A small canister erupted beneath the wooden planks with a hiss. Fire flared in an instant, licking at the edges of the curtain. Galt sprang backward like a marionette cut from its strings and disappeared into the wings. Watson! After him! Holmes cried. I gave chase, boots pounding over the creaking boards. Flames licked higher, casting mad shadows across the velvet walls. I caught a glimpse of Galt's coat as he vanished through a trapdoor behind the stage. Holmes and I descended into the passage beneath the theatre, where the scent of mildew and dust choked the air. The stone corridor twisted and turned, an old performer's tunnel used to exit unseen. We followed it to its end, but found only darkness. Galt was gone. Holmes stared into the void, the edge of his face glowing from the flicker of firelight behind us. "He's sealed it behind him," Holmes said. "Another tunnel, no doubt. He's had years to prepare it." I caught my breath. "Then we've lost him." "For now," Holmes replied, "but not for long." As we emerged into the chill night, the theatre burning behind us, I looked back at the glowing skeleton of the building. Puppets burned in silence, limbs crackling, strings dissolving into smoke. The show, it seemed, had ended without applause. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in the final clue. Revealed. We returned to Baker Street as dawn broke over the soot-streaked rooftops of London. Smoke still curled faintly from the smouldering ruin of the Lichfield Theatre, and though Galt had vanished, Holmes's composure suggested the chase was far from over. He did not rest. No sooner had we arrived than he discarded his coat, lit his pipe, and paced the sitting room in erratic lines, his eyes distant. The fire crackled quietly, and I, weary from the night's pursuit, sat slumped in my armchair, watching him with a mixture of awe and exasperation. "He burned the theatre," I muttered. "Destroyed evidence, nearly vanished into myth. How do you expect to find him again?" Holmes turned sharply. "He made a mistake, Watson, a subtle one, but one I fully intend to exploit." "What mistake?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved to the desk and began arranging papers. Garnett's journal pages, sketches of the marionettes, theater programs, police reports, even the scorched parchment Galt had clutched in his final monologue. He studied them with hawk-like precision. "Consider this," Holmes said finally, tapping Garnett's final page. "The so-called prophecy. It described the burning stage, the vanishing puppet master. It was theatrics, yes, but also a coded sequence. Garnett was not mad. He was clever. He left a cipher hidden in the structure of the narrative." I rose, peering over his shoulder. "You mean the final page wasn't about destruction? It was about direction?" "Exactly." Holmes pointed to a line. "The stage burns, but one survives, buried where the audience never sat." Galt believed it literal. He saw it as an end, but Garnett intended it as a beginning, buried where the audience never sat. That is the key. I frowned. "But what does it mean?" Holmes's smile was thin. "The theater's seating chart, Watson. There was a mezzanine in the old Lichfield, used before renovations in 1870. That upper section was condemned. Deemed unsafe, it was never reopened. In fact, no audience had sat there in over 30 years. My heart quickened. "You think something was hidden there?" "More than that. I believe Garnett, or Galt, following his twisted inspiration, concealed a physical item, perhaps a ledger, a draft of the final script, something vital to the truth. Galt couldn't retrieve it without arousing suspicion, but now that the theater is destroyed, he may assume it's irretrievable." "And is it?" Holmes smiled and reached into his coat. From an inner pocket, he drew a small folded object wrapped in oilskin. "You found it," I breathed. "I climbed the remnants of the mezzanine after you returned to the fire brigade. It was precarious, but the spot matched the line perfectly. Hidden beneath the floorboards of a row never occupied since Garnett's time. This," he said, unfolding the object, "is the heart of the mystery." Inside the oilskin was a slim, leather-bound notebook, singed at the corners, the name Isaac Garnett etched into the spine. Holmes opened it to the final entries. "Listen to this," he said, reading aloud. "I saw him again tonight. He waited behind the curtain after the audience departed. He calls himself Victor, but I know that voice. I know that gait. He was mine once, my finest puppet. Now he believes himself real. My skin prickled. A puppet who believed he was real? I asked. Not literal, Holmes murmured. Symbolic. A former actor, perhaps. Or a protégé. Someone Garnett taught and who then turned on him. He flipped another page. Victor's eyes gleamed like firelight. He says the audience betrayed us, that they turned to new amusements. He speaks of vengeance. I fear what he intends. We sat in silence. Then I said, Victor. Galt's middle name is Victor, is it not? Holmes nodded. You see it now. He was the pupil. Or perhaps the unfinished puppet Garnett never meant to complete, but Galt completed himself in fire and shadow. Holmes closed the notebook and stood. It is time. We have what we need. Let us prepare the final scene. I asked, where do we begin? Holmes's eyes narrowed. He will return, he said. Actors always crave an audience, and I intend to give him one. Chapter 15. The final gathering. It was not in the burnt-out husk of the Litchfield Theatre that Holmes chose to stage his finale, but in the drawing-room of the Ridlington Club, a private venue so rarely used that even the staff had to be reminded it still existed. With its high velvet curtains, oil paintings of long-dead founders, and stiff armchairs arranged like seats in a silent gallery, it bore just enough resemblance to a theatre to satisfy Holmes's theatrical instincts. I arrived an hour early to find Holmes already setting the scene. He moved with an actor's economy, adjusting lighting, pacing out intervals between chairs, and placing a singular marionette on the mantelpiece, its blank eyes facing the room like a silent observer. You expect him to walk into this? I asked, glancing at the marionette. Knowing you're waiting? I expect him to be drawn to it, Holmes replied. This, Watson, is not merely a trap. It is a mirror. A chance for him to perform the final act before an audience that will, at last, understand the script. He straightened a chair and nodded toward the heavy entrance doors. Lestrade will arrive shortly with our cast of players. Indeed, no sooner had he spoken than the muffled sound of carriage wheels and boots on cobblestone announced the arrival of our guests. They entered in uneasy pairs, Inspector Lestrade, tight-lipped and skeptical as ever. Edwin Blake, the anxious stage hand with nicotine-stained fingers. Miss Maud Hensley, the sharp-eyed costume mistress whose gaze darted from shadow to shadow. And finally, a late arrival, Miss Delia Marston, the widowed theatre manager, dressed in deepest black, her veil only half raised. They sat uneasily, murmuring pleasantries and avoiding eye contact. I hope, Lestrade said, folding his arms, that this isn't another one of your mind games, Holmes. We've got enough trouble without... Holmes raised a hand. All will be made clear, Inspector. But for the moment, I ask only your patience. The performance is about to begin. No one spoke. Holmes moved to the fireplace, where the marionette remained poised. This puppet, he began, was discovered buried beneath the mezzanine of the Litchfield Theatre, untouched for decades. Alongside it, a notebook written by Isaac Garnett in the final days before his disappearance. There was a rustle of movement. Miss Marston stiffened visibly. Miss Hensley dropped her eyes to the floor. Holmes continued. Contained within were descriptions of a man, Victor, a presence in the theatre long after the performances had ceased. A former actor, a student. No. Garnett spoke of him not as a man, but as something incomplete, a reflection, a shadow that learned to walk upright. A clock ticked somewhere in the stillness. Even Lestrade had gone quiet. Victor Galt, Holmes said, turning to face the group, was that shadow, and it is my belief that each of you, whether by design or circumstance, were drawn into his tragic narrative. Miss Marston clutched her bag tighter. What do you mean, drawn in? Holmes walked slowly across the room, his footsteps light. You inherited the theatre, Miss Marston, but you did not clear the upper levels as required. Why? Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. You, he said, turning to Blake, repaired Garnett's original puppets, yet one, the one found in the mezzanine, was unknown to you. A design you'd never seen. You called it grotesque. Blake nodded slowly, color draining from his face. And Miss Hensley, Holmes said gently, you told me you heard footsteps after hours, whispering. You believed the theater was haunted, but you stayed. Why? I thought it was memory, she whispered, the building remembering things. People. Holmes faced them all now. He made you part of his illusion. Galt believed himself the heir of Garnett's genius, but he needed an audience to validate the performance. You gave it to him, unwittingly. The doors creaked, all heads turned. A figure entered quietly, as if stepping through the invisible curtain of an unseen stage. Victor Galt. Hair disheveled, clothes still scorched with ash from the fire, he stood silently in the doorway, his hands open. I came, he said simply. Holmes inclined his head. Of course you did. The room held its breath. Galt's eyes flicked to the puppet on the mantelpiece. You found him. I did, Holmes said. And in doing so, I found you. Chapter 16. The reveal. Holmes breaks down. The crime. Victor Galt stood frozen, not with fear, but with the peculiar stillness of a man who had spent a lifetime perfecting his own narrative, and was now, at last, forced to watch someone else recite it. I commend your punctuality, Mr. Galt, Holmes said, voice measured. You have a flair for entrances. No doubt cultivated during your time at the Guildford Conservatory, though your official records were expunged shortly after your expulsion. Galt blinked but said nothing. Holmes turned to the gathering. You see, ladies and gentlemen, Victor Galt was never a stage actor. He was a mimic, not in the performative sense, but in the psychological. A man born without the ballast of identity, drifting from one borrowed persona to the next. Miss Hensley shifted uncomfortably. Galt's eyes swept toward her, but Holmes intercepted. When Isaac Garnett died in that theater, something else was born. Galt, then a stagehand, barely 20 years of age, remained behind, obsessively, secretly. He lived beneath the theater like a parasite feeding on memory. Watson scribbled in his notebook beside me, but even I could barely keep pace with the quickening revelations. Garnett's puppets were not merely objects to Galt. They were family, archetypes. He rehearsed them obsessively, even after the curtains fell for the last time. But the true turning point was the fire. Holmes paced a half-circle around the room. The Litchfield fire was no accident. Galt, after years of isolation and delusion, sought to rebirth the theater through spectacle. What better way than to destroy it, only to rise from its ashes as the sole survivor of its legacy? Lestrade frowned. You mean he set the fire himself? Holmes nodded. Indeed. The flammable chemicals found behind the curtain, initially attributed to aging stage props, were of recent origin, purchased at a chemist in Highgate 2 weeks prior to the blaze. The signature on the receipt was forged, but the ink bore a unique scent, poppy oil, the same scent found on Galt's gloves when he was admitted to the hospital for smoke inhalation. Holmes let the silence settle before delivering the next blow. But the fire failed in one regard. It did not erase the past as completely as Galt had hoped. One puppet survived. That puppet. Holmes gestured to the marionette on the mantel. It had been hidden away by Garnett, not as a prop, but as a record. Inside the puppet's body cavity, cleverly concealed within the torso, I found a small scroll. It contained Garnett's final confession. Galt's jaw clenched. Garnett, it seems, had begun to fear the young man who lingered after hours. He documented his concerns, the strange disappearances of props, the mimicry, the acts of sabotage. He feared Galt, though he never confronted him directly. That scroll was Garnet's insurance. Watson glanced up from his notes, wide-eyed. And the deaths. The stage rigger, Harold Minks, and Lionel Carter, the puppeteer who drowned. Holmes raised a finger. Harold Minks died 10 years ago in what appeared to be an accident, but a second theatre worker, Lionel Carter, vanished shortly thereafter. Galt, fearing Garnet might have spoken to them, eliminated them both, though in different ways. One fell, the other never resurfaced. Galt spoke for the first time. They had no vision, he said, his voice hoarse. They laughed at Garnet's ideas, mocked the art. I gave it back. I restored it. You buried it, Holmes replied coldly. Under ash and silence. Galt took a step toward the puppet. Holmes moved to block him. No, he said firmly. You don't get to rewrite the final act. Miss Marston gasped softly. Then why return here tonight? Why come at all? Holmes answered before Galt could. Because he craves an audience, always has. And like all tragic figures, he wanted to be understood. Holmes reached into his coat and retrieved the scroll, the faded parchment delicately rolled. This was Garnet's voice, his legacy. It ends with one line, written shakily, but unmistakable. The boy watches me again. I see myself reflected in his eyes, but darker. The marionette seemed to shift ever so slightly in the firelight, as if bowing its painted head in silent judgment. Holmes turned once more to Galt. You are not the creator, Galt. You are the echo. And with that, he let the scroll fall gently into the hearth, where the flames consumed it in seconds. Victor Galt, his shoulders sagging, did not resist as Lestrade stepped forward and took him by the arm. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The morning after the revelation was a curious one. London awoke to mist and sleet, unusual for late March, but somehow appropriate. The city seemed subdued, as though it too was digesting the strange and macabre tale that had unfolded behind the velvet curtains of a forgotten theatre. The Penny Illustrated featured only a small column buried on page 4, its headline uninspired. Recluse arrested in burned theatre. Scotland Yard closes cold case. Scotland Yard, of course, had wasted no time taking credit for the arrest. Inspector Lestrade had released a short statement praising collaborative investigative efforts, without once mentioning Holmes by name. Holmes, as always, seemed neither surprised nor offended. Let them have their little stage, he said, seated by the fire at Baker Street, his eyes unfocused, his fingers steepled. We know the truth. Victor Galt had offered no resistance at the time of arrest. He remained mostly silent, save for a cryptic sentence uttered as Lestrade handcuffed him. A stage without an audience is a lie told to mirrors. When pressed to explain, he retreated into silence, staring past the gaslight in the holding cell as if watching a performance no one else could see. He won't last long, Lestrade had confided as we left the yard. One of the doctors believes he's not merely delusional, but fractured, like a puppet without strings. Now, as I sat opposite Holmes in the warm safety of our sitting room, I found myself disturbed not just by Galt's crimes, but by the strange sympathy he evoked. You believe he was mad? I asked, unsure if I was seeking reassurance or contradiction. Holmes exhaled a thin wisp of pipe smoke. Madness, Watson, is often a word used by the sane to avoid understanding the broken. Galt was not without reason. He was without anchor. That is far more dangerous. I frowned. But surely that makes him less culpable, not more. Holmes looked up at me. You are thinking morally. I'm speaking diagnostically. He believed the world had betrayed beauty, so he tried to remake it by burning down what remained. A silence passed between us. What will happen to him? I finally asked. Likely Bedlam or Broadmoor, Holmes replied. The judge may deem him unfit to plead, but justice... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Justice is not always the same as punishment. The theater he loved is gone, the puppets charred, and the only audience left was ourselves. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson appeared moments later with a small parcel. "No return address, Mr. Holmes," she said, eyeing it suspiciously. "Rather odd, if you ask me." Holmes opened it gingerly. Inside lay a small, soot-marked marionette head. The eyes were painted in delicate strokes, the lips in a faint smirk. Tucked beneath it was a single scrap of paper. "We all perform, Mr. Holmes. Some of us simply forget the curtain must fall." I felt a chill settle into my spine. Holmes regarded the puppet head for a long moment, then placed it gently back in the box and shut the lid. "Another echo," he murmured, even after the final act. He tucked the parcel into the corner of the mantel beside his Stradivarius. Then he stood, brushing the ash from his coat. "Come, Watson. Let us not linger in phantoms. I hear the Countess of Wexley has misplaced her diamond tiara at a dinner party with only 6 guests." "A locked room puzzle?" I asked, glad for something lighter. Holmes smiled faintly. "Perhaps. Or perhaps simply a case of misremembered claret. In either case, it will be good to chase something less theatrical." As we stepped out into the grey London morning, I found myself glancing back at the puppet box once more. It sat still and closed, yet I could not help but imagine it watching us, its wooden face worn but knowing. Perhaps that was Galt's final trick, to leave behind a symbol that would linger in the mind like a half-forgotten melody. But Holmes was right. The curtain had fallen, and the case, for all its strange poetry, was closed. Chapter 18. Holmes' Final Reflection. It was nearly a fortnight later when I found Holmes once again gazing out our sitting-room window, the London dusk tracing long shadows across the Persian rug beneath his chair. The Galt case had concluded. Scotland Yard had secured its statement of closure. The newspapers, having never fully grasped the strangeness of the matter, had moved on to fresher scandals. Victor Galt was confined at Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum, where he had taken to speaking only in rhymed couplets and asking the nurses if they could still see the strings above their heads. But Holmes, in his curious way, had not entirely let the case go. He sat motionless for several minutes, the puppet box still tucked beside the fireplace. He had neither discarded it nor opened it again. That restraint, more than any deduction, told me the matter still haunted him. "You haven't touched the violin in days," I observed gently, setting aside a medical journal. "Indeed," Holmes said, his voice low. "The strings feel false." A silence settled. "You were disturbed by him, weren't you?" I ventured. Holmes turned his gaze from the window. "Not disturbed, Watson. Intrigued, and dare I say, unsettled." Galt's mind was no blunt instrument. It was a finely tuned mechanism bent ever so slightly off its axis. That is far more chilling than mere madness. He stood and moved toward the hearth, gazing down at the puppet box. Most criminals desire gain, escape, power, or revenge. Galt desired only attention, but not in the base sense. He wanted audience, witness, as though his existence was validated only if observed. "Isn't that what theater is?" I asked. "Yes," Holmes said, folding his arms. "And yet, he never performed for a soul. His entire opus was rendered in secrecy. Art meant for no eye, tragedy meant for no tear. That is what separates him from the common actor." I followed his gaze. "He burned it all himself." Holmes nodded slowly. "He destroyed his life's work because it was pure in solitude. Once discovered, it would become contaminated by gaze. And yet he invited us in the end. That contradiction is heartbreaking." He took a breath, then moved to his armchair and finally, almost ritualistically, lit his pipe. "You recall his final phrase?" Holmes asked. I did. We all perform, Mr. Holmes. Some of us simply forget the curtain must fall. A confession? I asked. Holmes shook his head. A prophecy, or perhaps a warning. You see, Watson, Galt was not only speaking of himself. He was speaking of all men, all roles. The butcher, the constable, the lover, the doctor, the detective. We are all cast in roles we did not audition for. The tragedy is not that the curtain falls, but that we believe the play is real. Are you suggesting none of it matters? Holmes gave one of his rare, tight-lipped smiles. Quite the contrary. I suggest it matters precisely because it ends. Galt destroyed his theatre because he could not bear its eventual decay. He mistook impermanence for insignificance. I remained silent, struck by the weight of his words. Holmes continued, There is beauty in the ephemeral, Watson. The cherry blossom, the dying note of a violin, a case that concludes before it festers. The curtain must fall, but what happens before then is ours, and it is real enough. He tapped the edge of the pipe against the ashtray and stood. You're waxing rather poetic, I said. Too much time spent among puppets, perhaps. He moved toward the window again, his hands behind his back. There will be other cases, he said, other enigmas, but none quite like this. Galt made puppets to reflect a world that had forgotten how to watch. I, meanwhile, observe a world that has forgotten how to feel. And what of us? I asked quietly. Are we part of the play? Holmes looked at me then, his eyes briefly softening. We are all part of it, Watson. But the great secret is this. Though we did not write the script, we may still choose how to speak our lines. And with that, he turned once more to the window as outside, the sun finally set behind the grey London skyline, casting the stage into shadow and drawing the curtain gently closed.